A courtroom fine, just a slap on the wrist, or the start of something far darker. When a powerful judge tries to humiliate and discredit a black man in open court, thinking he's just another face to push around, he has no clue who he's up against. Because this isn't just any man, he's a federal prosecutor, calm, brilliant, and absolutely done playing by their rules. What follows is a stunning unraveling of arrogance, racism, and corruption at the highest level. And trust me, what happens next will leave you speechless. So before we dive in, let us know in the comments what time you're listening and where you're tuning in from. We read every single one, and we love hearing your voices. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and buckle up, this one's going to stay with you. It was already too hot for 9 a.m. when Derek Langston stepped through the courthouse doors, the Alabama sun at his back, and a folder clutched tightly in his hand. The air inside hit him like a wall of old dust and bureaucracy, thick with the scent of overwaxed floors and decades of quiet injustice. He paused just past the metal detectors, adjusting the cuff of his faded gray suit, a hand-me-down from his late father that never quite fit across the shoulders, and took a slow breath that did little to calm the weight pressing against his chest. Around him, the Montgomery Municipal Courthouse buzzed with tired footsteps, shuffling papers, and the creak of benches that had held too many stories like his for far too long. He found his courtroom, Division C Judge Roy Easton, and slid into a seat near the front, his jaw clenched but his face unreadable. It was a parking ticket, nothing more on paper, but something about the way the citation had been delivered, clipped to his windshield with a bright orange sticker that read, "Final Notice," on the very first day it was issued, had not sat right. Still, he wasn't here to stir trouble. He just wanted it dismissed quietly, properly, the way any citizen would expect if they had evidence the ticket was a clerical mistake. But as the judge entered, Derek saw it in his eyes, the casual superiority, the way Easton's gaze scanned the room and lingered half a second too long on anyone who didn't match his own reflection. Next case, Langston Derek. The clerk called, voice flat and practiced. Derek stood and made his way to the front, every eye in the room grazing his back like wind through tall grass. He placed the folder on the podium and looked up at the man perched high above the courtroom in a worn black robe, white hair trimmed close to his scalp, mouth pursed like he was already disappointed. "Your Honor," Derek began, his tone measured, respectful, "I'm here to contest a citation issued on the 17th of April. I have time-stamped photos showing I was parked legally." Judge Easton cut him off with a wave of his hand, eyes narrowing. "You were in violation of posted signage," he said coldly. "That's not up for debate." "With all due respect, Sir," Derek said, keeping his voice even. The sign in question was obstructed by city scaffolding. "The photos show this clearly, and I believe there's been a clerical error in how the fine was assessed." There was a long pause, the kind of pause that doesn't come from thought but from the slow sharpening of a blade. Judge Easton leaned forward, one elbow on the bench, the weight of authority gathering like a storm behind his voice. "Mr. Langston, I don't appreciate being corrected in my courtroom. You may think you're clever bringing in your photos and legal speak, but what I see here is a man wasting the court's time over a parking ticket." Derek stood silent for a moment, willing the heat from his collar to stay where it was and not rise to his face. He could feel his heart thudding, not with fear but with something older and heavier. "I assure you, Your Honor, I'm only here to correct a mistake." Another pause. Then with a tone as sharp as a slap, Easton declared, "Then let me correct yours. $1,000. Contempt of court." The words echoed in the silence that followed like a dropped glass in a quiet room. A murmur stirred behind him, but Derek didn't turn. He didn't blink. He only stared straight ahead, jaw tight, not in defiance but in sheer disbelief. $1,000 for a respectful correction, for showing up prepared, for being who he was. The silence behind him fractured with quiet gasps, but Easton didn't flinch. He banged the gavel once like punctuation, the kind that closes doors. As Derek gathered his papers, his hands moved slowly, not from hesitation, but from a kind of restraint that had been bred into him over decades. The courtroom was no longer a place of fairness, if it ever had been. It was theater, and today's act had made clear exactly who was meant to stay silent in their seat. He turned without a word, walking back past rows of wooden benches, past strangers who either stared or looked away, and pushed through the heavy doors that gave way with a groan. Outside, the sunlight caught the edge of the courthouse steps, and sliced across the concrete like a warning. Derek Langston paused at the bottom of the stairs, the air heavy again, full of cicadas and old history. He looked back once, not at the building but at what had just taken place inside. Not rage, not yet, but something had shifted in his chest. Something deep and deliberate, like a seed breaking open beneath soil. He adjusted the strap of his worn leather briefcase, then walked away, the gavel's echo still lodged behind his ribs like a splinter. The courtroom had gone quiet, the kind of silence that doesn't comfort, but curls around your spine like cold mist. Derek Langston stood frozen at the podium, his hands still resting on the edge fingertips, brushing the edge of the file he never got the chance to open. His mind registered the gavel's final crack, but his body hadn't moved yet, as if some unseen weight was pressing down on his shoulders, anchoring him in the very place he'd just been humiliated. He heard a chair scrape somewhere in the back, the shifting of papers, someone clearing their throat too loudly, but none of it mattered. All he could hear was the judge's voice still ringing in his head, each word like sandpaper dragged across skin. $1,000. Contempt of court. For daring to speak. He finally stepped back from the podium, his movements slow, deliberate, not because he was unsure, but because anything faster would have betrayed the storm rising in his chest. His eyes flicked toward the gallery not to find sympathy, but to confirm what he already knew, that every gaze, every whisper, every breath in that room had been waiting for him to crack. He didn't. Instead, he collected his papers without a word, tucked them neatly into the folder, and turned to leave, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached at the hinge. As he reached the heavy oak doors, the clerk's voice called after him, flat and almost performative. Next case. He didn't turn back. The door creaked open and he stepped into the hallway where the air was somehow both cooler and heavier. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting a pale wash over the beige walls and faded carpet, the kind of institutional blandness that stripped places of memory. Derek walked slowly down the corridor, passing others waiting their turn, some seated on benches, others pacing with restless fingers and downcast eyes. No one met his gaze. He didn't expect them to. Outside, the sunlight was sharper now, almost white-hot against the courthouse steps, and he squinted as he stood at the top of the landing, looking out across the cracked pavement and faded parking lot below. He took a breath deeper this time, but it caught halfway, sticking in his chest like a word unspoken. For a long moment he didn't move. He just stood there, the folder still pressed tightly under his arm, feeling the weight of something much bigger than a traffic ticket settle into his bones. It wasn't the fine that stung, not really. Derek could afford the $1,000, even if it was outrageous. What he couldn't afford was the precedent, the way Easton had looked at him, the way his credentials, his experience, his entire career had meant absolutely nothing in that room. That was what stuck to his skin, what curled under his collar, and made his breath catch. He wasn't just silenced, he was dismissed. Stripped down to nothing but skin color in a room that claimed to serve justice. At the bottom of the steps, an older woman with a cane passed him, her steps careful on the uneven concrete. She looked up briefly, and their eyes met. She didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't say anything. But something in her gaze held a quiet understanding, an acknowledgement of the weight he carried, even if neither of them spoke it aloud. When she disappeared into the building, Derek finally moved, walking toward his car, parked in the far corner of the lot beneath the thin shadow of a dying oak tree. The inside of the car was stifling, oven-hot and stale, but he didn't start the engine right away. He sat there, hands resting on the wheel, staring out the windshield at nothing in particular. The heat pressed in from every direction, soaking through his shirt, pooling at the small of his back. Still, he didn't move. His phone buzzed once in the passenger seat, a message from his assistant, probably wondering if he was on his way back. He didn't check it. Not yet. His reflection in the rearview mirror caught his attention. Tired eyes, brow furrowed, sweat clinging to his temples. A man who had fought bigger battles than this, but somehow this one cut deeper. He'd taken on cartel bosses, chased down white-collar criminals who'd drained entire communities dry, and yet none of those had left him feeling quite as exposed as standing in that courtroom just now. $1,000 fine, that was nothing. Being called clever in that tone, being waved off like a child, that was everything. Hell of a thing, he muttered to himself, voice low, eyes still fixed on the mirror. Didn't even see it coming. He turned the key. The engine sputtered to life with a reluctant growl, the air conditioner gasping before it pushed out a breath of lukewarm air. Derek pulled out slowly, tires crunching over loose gravel, his gaze flicking up to the courthouse one last time as he turned out of the lot. The building looked the same as it always had, tall, plain, quietly intimidating, but it felt different now. It wasn't just a place where legal matters were settled. It was a place where power flexed its muscles in silence, cloaked in robes and ceremony. As he merged onto the main road, traffic thick and crawling, Derek let the folder slide from the seat beside him to the floor, the papers inside no longer relevant. The ticket didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the line that had been drawn today, clear, sharp, and unmistakable. A line between who the system pretended to serve and who it actually did. He adjusted the rearview mirror not to check traffic, but to look himself in the eye one more time, then whispered something so low it barely escaped his lips. "All right then. Let's see how deep this goes." And just like that, he rolled up the window, turned up the AC, and disappeared into the heat and dust of Montgomery, the courthouse shrinking behind him like a memory he didn't ask for but couldn't unsee. The morning after the courtroom incident, Derek Langston sat at his desk in the Southern District office, staring at a half-empty mug of cold coffee, its surface rippling slightly each time he tapped his fingers against the chipped ceramic. The blinds were half closed, letting in just enough light to remind him the world outside was already moving fast. But inside this office, quiet, dusty, and lined with stacks of folders, time seemed to stretch and blur. His tie hung loose around his neck, and his jacket had been tossed over the back of a chair hours earlier, abandoned like the small optimism he carried when he'd first walked into court the day before. The monitor on his desk blinked softly with a waiting email, draft the subject line still empty, the body blank except for the first few words, "to whom it may concern." He couldn't focus. Every time he tried to type, his mind wandered back to the smirk on Judge Easton's face, the way he seemed to enjoy pressing that gavel down like it was a weapon. Not just authority power, Derek thought, wielded like a club not to maintain order, but to draw a line between who mattered and who didn't. His phone buzzed once, then again. The first was a calendar reminder for a status hearing in a federal drug case. The second was a message from Trina, his legal assistant, "Call me ASAP, something's going around." Derek sat up straighter, suddenly alert, as if someone had cracked a window and let cold air rush in. He picked up the phone and called, waiting through 2 rings before her voice answered, low and tense. "I think someone's talking to the press," she said without preamble. "Or at least pretending they are. There's a blog out of Birmingham saying you're being reviewed for misconduct. They're using your name, your office." Derek didn't respond right away. He leaned back, eyes closing briefly, fingers pressing against his temple, as if he could smooth out the sudden pressure building behind his eyes. "Is it credible?" he asked, his voice even but quieter now, as if the walls might be listening. "Or just smoke?" Trina sighed through the phone, and he could hear her flipping papers in the background. "Hard to say," she murmured, "but it's moving fast. 2 local forums already reposted it. There's a claim you threatened a judge. No names, but the timing lines up. You know how this kind of rumor works. Facts don't matter as much as tone." He rubbed his jaw unshaven from the night before, the stubble scratching under his palm. "Who leaked it?" he asked, though they both knew the answer was probably no one and everyone. A nudge from the wrong mouth at the right bar. A whisper traded between courthouse interns. A push from someone who wanted to keep him quiet or distracted, or both. "I'll handle it," he said finally, and hung up before she could reply. His heart was already beating faster now, not with panic, but with a sharper kind of awareness, like a runner hearing footsteps behind him on a long, empty road. He stood and walked to the window, pulling the blinds open wider, watching the morning traffic glide past below, slow and indifferent. Across the street, a man pushed a cart full of cardboard, one wheel squealing, with each turn his head bowed beneath the weight of something unseen. Derek turned away. He knew how fast a man's reputation could shift, how a shadow thrown the right way could turn a principled attorney into a headline, a target, a warning. He sat again this time with purpose and began typing, not a complaint, not yet, but a detailed memo, names, dates, docket numbers, the exact transcript from the courtroom. He opened a second window on his screen and began searching media archives for previous stories about Judge Easton. There weren't many, but one caught his eye, a small piece from 2016, mentioning a lawsuit that quietly disappeared after a settlement agreement. The plaintiff, a black attorney, claimed racial bias in court procedures. The name was familiar, too familiar. As he scrolled further, a chill crept up his spine, settling at the base of his neck. The same patterns, the same words, disrespectful tone, disruption of decorum, contempt, fine, different faces. Same result. Derek leaned back, exhaling slowly, his thoughts suddenly clearer than they'd been in hours. Someone wanted him boxed in, discredited, maybe worse, but they had made a mistake. They underestimated what he could see when he started looking. His eyes wandered to the photo frame on his desk, a black and white picture of his father, standing outside the old barbershop, clippers in hand, smile bright despite everything the world had thrown at him. Derek had grown up in the back of that shop, sweeping hair off the floor and listening to old men talk about battles fought with dignity, because sometimes dignity was the only weapon they had. He looked down at his hands, steady now, and whispered, not to the room, not to the office, but maybe to himself. "All right then, you want to fight, let's fight." He closed the tabs, saved the memo, and stood with a purpose that hadn't been there an hour before. The air in the room felt different now, no lighter, but charged with something focused, something real. The fine, the insult, the quiet smear campaign, it wasn't personal anymore. It was structural, and if they thought he'd back down, they hadn't paid attention to how he got this far in the first place. He reached for his jacket, slid it over his shoulders, and headed for the door, pausing only once to glance back at the quiet hum of his office. Papers neatly stacked, monitor still glowing, coffee going cold, a room waiting for someone to decide whether they were just going to do their job, or whether they were ready to confront something uglier than a citation. Derek Langston chose quietly without drama and walked out. The hallway outside was still, and as the door clicked shut behind him, all that remained was the faint echo of his footsteps even, and determined fading down the tiled corridor of a place that would soon realize it had underestimated the wrong man. The call came just before midnight, a tremor in the silence of Derek Langston's apartment that snapped him from half-sleep and jolted him upright in bed before the second ring had finished echoing through the dark. He reached for the phone with fingers still sluggish from fatigue, blinking against the glow of the screen, as his mother's name flashed in bold letters, and instantly a tightness gripped his chest like an old warning returned. He answered quickly, pressing the phone to his ear, and before he could say a word, her voice broke through, raw, shaky, and ragged with breath. "Derek, baby, they came." She said her words, tumbling out too fast, almost slurred from panic. They stormed in here. 4 of them. Said there was something about drugs, about a tip. But they didn't even knock. He swung his legs off the bed and planted his feet firmly on the cool wooden floor, already reaching for his jeans with one hand, as the other held the phone tighter against his cheek. "Mom, are you hurt? Are you safe right now?" His voice was low, controlled, the kind of calm that only came from long years in a courtroom, and even longer years of learning when not to show fear. She paused, then let out a shaky breath. "I'm not hurt, no, just scared. They tore everything up. The drawers, the closets, they knocked the lamp over. They went through your father's things. The pictures, Derek, they ripped the damn pictures." He could hear it now in her voice, that quiet devastation that came not from physical pain, but from the shattering of something sacred: memory, dignity, peace. He grabbed his wallet, his keys pulled on a t-shirt without looking, and was out the door within seconds, the building's stairwell echoing with the sound of his footsteps as he moved with single-minded urgency. The drive was 15 minutes, but every red light felt like an insult, every quiet intersection, a delay he didn't have the patience for. The roads were empty, the city asleep, but his thoughts were loud, screaming questions without answers. Who tipped them off? Why her house? And why now, right after that courtroom stunt and the blog post stirring the waters? It didn't feel random. It felt like a warning, signed not with words, but with broken glass and trampled memories. When he pulled up in front of his mother's home, the porch light was still on, casting a pale, flickering glow across the cracked concrete and the overturned flower pots that had once lined the steps. The front door hung slightly ajar, its frame splintered near the handle, and the sight of it stopped him cold for a moment. Not because he was afraid to go in, but because he knew in that instant that something sacred had been violated in a way that wouldn't be easily undone. Inside the living room was a storm of scattered cushions, broken picture frames, and drawers flung open like emptied wounds. His mother sat on the edge of the couch, her housecoat wrinkled, her hair loose from its usual bun eyes, rimmed red and shining. She didn't rise to greet him, didn't say a word when he stepped in. She just looked up with the quiet ache of someone too tired to be angry. Derek knelt beside her, gently taking her hands in his. "I'm here, Mom. I've got you," he whispered, though he knew those words couldn't fix anything tonight. She nodded slowly, her voice barely a whisper. They said it was a tip, but they laughed, Derek. Laughed like they already knew they wouldn't find anything. Like they just wanted to remind me, we don't matter. He swallowed hard, letting those words sit between them for a beat, before rising and scanning the room, his eyes catching on the pieces of a torn photograph lying near the bookshelf. It was the one of his father in the barber shop, the one with his arm around a 10-year-old Derek, both of them smiling wide, with the kind of pride that only comes when you believe the world is starting to turn in your favor. Now it was in pieces. Boot prints and dust marked the floor around it. He crouched and gathered the fragments carefully, each movement slow, precise, reverent. It wasn't about saving the photo, it was about holding on to the proof that something once existed here that deserved respect. After ensuring his mother was safe and the door was secured, Derek sat on the porch for a long time, elbows on his knees, phone clutched loosely in one hand, staring out at the stillness of the street. The cicadas had quieted, the air was thick with humidity, and somewhere down the block a dog barked once and then went quiet again. It was the kind of silence that didn't comfort, it pressed. He made one call, brief and low. This wasn't random. Easton's behind this or someone close. Start pulling threads. No names, no details. Just the kind of instruction that signaled a man was done waiting for permission to act. Before he went back inside, he looked up at the streetlight overhead, flickering slightly, casting long shadows across the porch. He thought of how many times he'd walked this path as a boy coming home after school, the smell of his mother's greens cooking in the kitchen, his father's laughter echoing from the shop 2 blocks down. Now the air smelled of broken things, of intrusion, of message sent. And still beneath the anger and the resolve that hardened like concrete in his chest, there was something deeper, a realization that this wasn't just about him anymore. Not about pride or dignity, or even his own career. They'd come into his mother's house, uninvited, and stepped on everything he loved just to make a point. He stood slowly, letting one hand rest on the porch rail, his gaze fixed out toward the darkness that stretched beyond the street. Then he said it barely above a whisper, but heavy with meaning. They made it personal. And in that moment, under the dim light of a flickering bulb and the watchful stillness of the night, Derek Langston made a quiet promise to himself. He wouldn't let it end here. But not tonight. Tonight he would sit with his mother, clean up what he could, and tape together the pieces of a photo that still meant something. Tomorrow would bring the fight. Tonight was about remembering why it mattered. At 6:47 the next morning, Derek Langston sat alone in his office, the sun not yet cutting through the haze that hung over downtown Montgomery, and the only sounds were the slow hum of the air vents and the occasional metallic clatter of the elevator settling on another floor. The federal building was still mostly asleep. No staffers rushing in, no phones ringing, no printers screaming into motion. Just Derek, a black coffee growing cold on the desk beside him, and a screen filled with case files he hadn't looked at in months. He wasn't here for cartel briefings or pending motions. He was here for Judge Roy Easton. And this time he wasn't looking for a courtroom argument, he was looking for a pattern. He opened a database. The public rarely saw one that required multiple logins, 2-factor codes, and a quiet kind of authority to access the kind of system that stored raw court data without spin or story. The cursor blinked against the pale gray background as he typed slowly, deliberately, Easton Roy H. Then he filtered by offense-type, defendant, race, and penalty severity. What returned wasn't shocking. It was sickening, and it was systematic. The screen populated with more than 1,000 entries spanning over 15 years. Derek narrowed the results further. He filtered for misdemeanor violations, contempt of court fines, and procedural sanctions. The numbers started to tell a story. Black defendants fined at triple the rate of white defendants for late arrivals, for speaking out of turn, for non-compliance. That read more like disobedience than danger. In more than a dozen cases, black defendants had been fined over $500 for first-time infractions, while white defendants in nearly identical circumstances walked out with warnings or symbolic $20 citations. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose, eyes narrowing, the early light from the window spilling in muted streaks across his desk. "It's not just bias," he murmured to himself. "It's operational." And that realization hit harder than anything the judge had said in court. Because bias can be explained away, attributed to mood or moment, but structure is planned. Structure is chosen. Pulling a notepad closer, he began taking notes, cross-referencing names, noting down case numbers, highlighting outliers. One line stood out: Sherry Eubanks, 33, fined $750 for parking on a faded yellow curb. No signage, no hazard. Just below it, another Daniel Reese, 40, parked in the exact same spot 4 days later. White. Warning issued. Derek circled the two names 3 times, his pen pressing so hard the paper tore slightly beneath the tip. Outside his office window, the city was beginning to wake cars, inching through intersections, buses, releasing steam at every stop, and early birds lining up at the corner bakery for coffee and newsprint. But inside these walls, Derek felt like he'd stepped into something colder, something older than traffic tickets or contempt fines. This was about control. This was about a man sitting in a black robe on a wooden bench deciding who deserved a slap on the wrist and who deserved to be broken, and doing it so many times it had become policy written in silence. He pushed his chair back and stood stretching his back with a quiet groan, then walked over to the cabinet by the door, pulling out the red case files he'd quietly gathered over the years, ones no one wanted to re-examine. He opened one at random, flipping past the court summary to the sentencing note: defendant displayed inappropriate attitude. Penalty increased accordingly. There was no legal definition for attitude, no statute describing how a person's posture or tone should add $300 to a fine, but there it was, in writing, signed by Easton, dated sealed. Derek rubbed his eyes and sat again, this time with a new clarity. He opened an internal report template, titled it Pattern of Judicial Disparity Preliminary Findings, and began to draft what would become the foundation of a formal judicial ethics complaint. He knew the risks. This wasn't a memo passed quietly between colleagues. This was a spark. And in a building like this, surrounded by people who valued order over honesty, sparks either caught fire or got stomped out fast. Still, he kept writing. Facts first. Data lined up clean and tight. Then came the analysis, careful language, strong verbs, no room for misinterpretation. When he was finished, he leaned back once more, letting the hum of the overhead lights replace the pounding in his ears. The document wasn't flashy, but it was solid, enough to warrant a deeper look, enough to ask the questions no one had dared to ask in years. Before hitting save, Derek glanced at the photograph pinned to the bulletin board beside his desk. It showed him years ago, standing in front of the courthouse in his first year as an assistant U.S. attorney, a quiet pride in his eyes, a fresh suit that didn't quite fit, and a future he still believed would be shaped by justice, not games. That version of himself stared back now, hopeful, steady, maybe a little naive, and Derek felt a pang of something bittersweet settle in his chest. He saved the report, closed the file, then turned off the monitor. As he stood again, the office felt different, smaller, heavier, as if the room itself understood the weight of what had just been written. He walked to the window and looked out across the city, where sunlight had finally broken through the clouds and painted the rooftops in a soft golden hue. Below, a father walked his son across the street, one hand on the boy's shoulder, the other pointing to something the child would remember for years. Derek didn't smile, but he did nod once slowly, to no one in particular. He turned from the window, locked the drawer where the printed report now lay, and grabbed his coat from the chair. As he walked out into the hall, his footsteps sounded firmer than before, each one echoing down the corridor with quiet purpose. Because now he wasn't just working cases, he was preparing to challenge the bench. The office was quiet when Derek Langston stepped in that evening, long past the usual hour when most desks had gone dark and coffee mugs had been rinsed and left to dry. The overhead lights hummed with the low buzz of an old building settling into silence, and the weight of everything he carried followed him inside like a shadow that refused to loosen its grip. He closed the door behind him gently, not wanting to wake the emptiness, then placed his leather case on the desk with a soft thud and stood still, taking in the room as if seeing it differently for the first time. Stacks of legal briefs lined the shelves, organized, but lived in next to framed photos of his mother, his daughter, and a younger version of himself, standing at a podium, hopeful, determined, untouched by the kind of storm he now found himself in. He unbuttoned his jacket, slowly slid it from his shoulders, and draped it over the back of his chair before sitting down with the kind of exhale that came not from exhaustion, but from quiet resolve gathering beneath the surface. He pulled open the drawer to his left, retrieved the memo he'd written earlier that day, and laid it flat before him, a plain manila folder marked only by the initials R.E. in neat block letters. Inside were the numbers, the cases, the language, and the unmistakable patterns that he could no longer pretend were coincidence. He flipped it open and stared at the first page, reading it again, though he already knew every sentence by heart. After a moment, he reached for the phone. The dial tone was steady, familiar grounding. He pressed the digits from memory and waited as the line rang 3 times before connecting. Mara Dixon speaking, came the voice on the other end, sharp, even, no nonsense, just as he remembered from the last case they'd worked together 2 years earlier. Derek took a breath, then spoke. "Mara, it's Derek Langston. I've got something, and I need your eyes on it before the end of the week." There was a pause, short, but charged with the kind of calculation that only came from someone who'd been in the trenches long enough to recognize when the water was rising. "Is this personal or official?" she asked, her tone neutral but curious. He leaned back, letting his fingers tap the edge of the desk lightly. "It started personal," he said, voice low, "but what I found? It's not just about me anymore." The silence on the line stretched for a beat, then she sighed. "All right. I'll be in my office early tomorrow. Can you be there by 8? "I'll bring the file," he replied, then added, "You might want to clear your calendar." That made her chuckle quietly, but there was no humor in it. "You always bring the fun, Langston," she said before hanging up. Derek sat for another moment in the quiet, staring at the phone as if it might ask him to confirm everything he'd just set in motion. The clock on the wall ticked softly each second, feeling like a step away from silence and towards something messier, louder, and far less forgiving. He knew how these things worked. Once you pulled a thread in a system like this, you had to be ready for the whole fabric to fight back. He placed the folder gently back into his briefcase, closed the clasp with a quiet snap, and stood again, moving slowly toward the window. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the humid night, and traffic flowed like distant murmurs, steady, indifferent, oblivious to the fact that somewhere up in that office tower, a man had just decided to challenge something much bigger than himself. And yet standing there, Derek didn't feel small. He felt focused, because the truth once seen can't be unseen, and once spoken aloud it demands either action or complicity. He turned away from the glass, switched off the light, and walked out of the room without looking back. The hallway was dim, the carpet muffling his footsteps, but each one felt heavier, now not with dread, but with decision. By the time the elevator doors slid closed behind him, his mind had already moved ahead to what came next. Subpoenas, pushback, maybe worse. But under all of it there was clarity. A kind of stillness that comes when a man stops waiting for the right moment and decides the moment is now. And as the building settled once more into its nightly quiet, the last thing left in the room was the faint echo of courage, rising where fear had once lived. The courtroom was packed that morning, not with lawyers or press, but with silence, tension, and eyes that knew exactly why they were there. Derek Langston walked in without ceremony, his shoes echoing against the polished tile floor, his breath slow and measured beneath the weight of what he was about to do. He carried no briefcase, no stack of exhibits or opening arguments, just a single manila folder tucked beneath his arm, and a presence that turned heads even before he took his place at the plaintiff's table. The judge had not yet entered, but already the air felt charged like the calm just before thunder breaks across the sky. Across the room, Mara Dixon gave him a subtle nod, reassuring, not performative, before shifting her gaze toward the courtroom door, where a federal observer had just entered, sitting near the back with a yellow notepad and a face that revealed nothing. This wasn't a hearing in name only. This was a reckoning in progress, and everyone who mattered had shown up to watch the first stone drop. Derek adjusted the knot of his tie, then reached into his folder and slid a printed report onto the desk. 8 pages, no more, clipped neatly at the top, with words that might as well have been dynamite. He didn't read them again. He didn't need to. He knew what they said because he had lived every page of it, not just the statistics, but the silence they represented, the eyes that had looked away, the voices that had never been allowed to rise. The bailiff called the room to order, and a few seconds later Judge Easton stepped through the side door, black robes, flowing chin lifted high as if daring the room to doubt his authority. He settled into his seat, slowly, hands folded on the bench, eyes scanning the gallery, with casual control, until they landed on Derek and something subtle shifted behind the judge's stare. It wasn't fear, not yet. But it was the first flicker of recognition that this wasn't going to be business as usual. "Mr. Langston," the judge said, voice crisp, clipped, and slightly irritated. "This court granted you time to submit your motion not to use this courtroom as a stage." Derek stood without hurry, his hands calm at his sides, his voice steady but resolute. "Your Honor, I intend to do neither. I'm here to present evidence." Evidence that concerns this court, your conduct, and over 200 decisions bearing your name." A murmur stirred in the gallery, not loud but enough to make the judge's jaw tighten. He leaned forward, fingers tapping once against the bench. "Mr. Langston, if you think—" "I don't think," Derek interrupted without raising his voice. "I know." He stepped closer, not by much, but just enough to meet the judge's eye directly. "For 15 years, this court has issued disproportionate fines against black defendants for minor offenses. You've called it discretion. I call it discrimination. And today I'm not asking you to defend yourself. I'm asking the Justice Department to begin the process of an investigation." Gasps erupted now, one from the corner near the court stenographer, another from a local reporter just pulling out a phone. But Derek didn't flinch, didn't turn his head toward the noise. He kept his gaze locked on the bench, on the man who had once treated his silence as consent, and who now had to sit in the discomfort of his own record laid bare. Easton's mouth opened slightly, but nothing came. Not yet. His hand moved to adjust a stack of documents beside him, an unconscious fidget, something to do while the weight of the moment pressed down harder than the gavel ever had. "I have submitted the report to the Federal Judicial Review Board," Derek continued, his tone. Not angry, not performative, just resolute, like a man delivering news that could not be undone. "The data is there. The patterns are there. And the witnesses are prepared to speak." For a long beat, no one moved. And then slowly, Easton leaned back, his expression unreadable, as if weighing his next move, not as a judge, but as a man who had just been publicly unmasked. "This isn't how these matters are handled," he said finally, voice lower now, less certain. "No, sir," Derek said quietly. "That's exactly the problem." He returned to his seat without another word, placed the folder beside him, and folded his hands, not in victory, not in gloating, but in something far deeper: peace. The kind that comes not when a battle is won, but when truth is spoken aloud and cannot be taken back. Mara glanced at him just for a moment, and beneath her usual composure there was a flash of something like admiration, something like belief. In the back of the room, the Federal observer stood, collected her notepad, and walked out without a sound. But everyone knew what that meant. This wasn't over. It had just begun. Outside, the sky was turning the color of copper sunlight, pushing through clouds like light through stained glass. Derek walked out of the courthouse alone, not flanked by press, not cheered by crowds, but with the quiet steadiness of a man who had just told the truth in the one place where it mattered most and refused to sit down when it got uncomfortable. He paused at the top of the steps, the wind brushing his coat, the city waking around him, and he let the weight of the moment settle, not like a burden, but like armor. And then he smiled. Just slightly. Just enough. Later that afternoon, as the courthouse parking lot began to thin and the buzz of reporters faded into memory, Derek Langston found himself standing alone beneath the tall oak tree that had once shaded the entryway to his father's barber shop. The barber shop had long since closed shuttered after his father's passing, but the tree still stood gnarled and stubborn, its limbs reaching out like arms that had seen too much and still refused to fall. Derek rested his hand against the bark, rough and cool, grounding himself in the presence of something older than the day's firestorm. His chest rose and fell with slow, measured breaths, but his mind hadn't slowed in hours. He had just done the unthinkable, called out a sitting judge in open court, submitted evidence of systemic misconduct, and named names without blinking. And while the courtroom had eventually emptied, leaving behind whispers and stares, the weight of what he'd unleashed now pressed against his ribcage like a second heartbeat. He wasn't afraid, not exactly, but there was an alertness in his bones, the kind that settles in after you throw the first punch and wait to see who swings back. His phone buzzed in his coat pocket. One message: "Mara, they're circling wagons. Be ready." He didn't respond. Not yet. Not because he didn't have words, but because some moments required stillness more than reaction. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked out across the street, where the courthouse rose like a monument to something that once claimed to be blind. Its steps were quiet now, its glass doors closed. But inside he knew gears were already turning. Men in suits were flipping through his report. Calls were being made, and somewhere, Roy Easton was no longer wondering if the world would notice, he was wondering how long he could outrun it. Derek stepped away from the tree and made his way toward his car, but halfway across the lot, a voice called out behind him. "Mr. Langston." A man in his early 30s approached, plain clothes, nervous posture, a press badge swinging from his lanyard. His eyes were eager but uncertain, like someone aware they were standing in the presence of a larger story than they were trained to tell. Derek paused, but didn't offer more than a nod. The reporter hesitated, then asked, "Is it true you submitted a federal misconduct report this morning?" "I did," Derek replied evenly, watching the man's pen begin to twitch against the notepad. "And do you believe Judge Easton's rulings were racially motivated?" Derek tilted his head slightly, not in annoyance but as if weighing how much truth the man could carry. "I believe the record speaks for itself," he said. "I believe over a decade of disproportionate punishment toward black defendants is not an accident. And I believe silence would make me complicit." The man scribbled furiously. "Will you be pressing charges?" "There's a process," Derek replied. "I've started it. That's what matters right now." He turned to leave again, but the reporter called after him once more. "Why now, Mr. Langston? After all these years?" Derek stopped just for a moment and looked over his shoulder. "Because they came into my mother's house," he said quietly, and made it personal. That answer didn't need follow-up. The reporter lowered his pad, nodded, and stepped back. Inside the car, the silence returned like an old friend, and Derek sat behind the wheel, staring straight ahead as the dashboard clock ticked forward. He remembered something his father used to say, "Truth doesn't knock. It kicks the damn door in." And today it had done just that. But even with that door wide open, Derek knew how the game worked. Retaliation didn't always look like rage. Sometimes it came as delayed denial distraction. Sometimes it wore a tie and smiled while sharpening the knife. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles pale against the leather, then let out a breath and started the engine. The car rumbled awake, steady and familiar, as he pulled out of the lot and merged into traffic, each red light, a reminder that the world outside still turned as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. In that courtroom. In him. The drive home was quiet, except for the soft hum of talk radio and the occasional ping of news alerts stacking up on his phone. He ignored them. He wasn't ready to hear how the world was spinning his story. He wasn't interested in sound bites or commentary. He was interested in consequences, real ones, measured in accountability, not airtime. When he reached his mother's house, the porch light was already on, casting a soft yellow glow across the chipped steps and flower pots she had just begun to replant. She opened the door before he knocked, wearing the same cardigan she always wore on heavy days, the kind with the sleeves too long and the pockets full of tissues and peppermints. "I saw it on the news," she said, gently stepping aside to let him in. Derek nodded and set his coat down on the rack. "Was it bad?" She smiled faintly, closed the door behind him. "They didn't say enough to hurt you. But they said enough to scare someone." He glanced at her. "You worried." "I've always worried," she replied, walking toward the kitchen. "That's a mother's job." He followed, and as the smell of her cooking filled the air, okra and onions, something earthy and warm, Derek felt the tension in his shoulders begin to soften, not disappear, just shift, into something quieter, something older. They ate in near silence, the kind that speaks louder than words, until finally she reached across the table and took his hand. "You did right, baby," she said, voice steady. "I raised you to know right from wrong, and to stand when others kneel. I don't care how loud they get, you keep standing." Derek looked down at her hand, then up into her eyes, and saw the same fire in her gaze that he had felt in his chest all day. Not rage, not vengeance, but clarity, and in that moment nothing needed saying. The truth had already spoken. By Thursday morning, the retaliation had sharpened into something more deliberate, more orchestrated than the quiet hostility Derek Langston had anticipated. It started with an internal audit request routine, in appearance thinly veiled in purpose, and quickly escalated into phone calls from unfamiliar numbers, questions disguised as concerns and rumors that slithered through the halls of a federal building like smoke no one would claim to see. He wasn't surprised, not really. But that didn't make it easier to absorb, not when every new email felt like a prelude to something designed to pull him under. He kept his head down, eyes on the casework, hands steady, as he sifted through files he knew better than most. The office was no longer just a place of law, it was a battlefield now, one lined not with bullets, but with glances, silences, and carefully worded denials. When he passed by certain desks, conversations paused, a beat too long. When he entered the conference room, chairs scraped the floor like distant warnings. Derek had been in combat before, but this war was quieter, colder, fought not with force but with erasure. Still, he pressed on. The findings he submitted had triggered a review, and the process was moving even if those around him pretended it wasn't. The Office of Judicial Conduct had acknowledged receipt. Federal oversight had requested supporting documentation. And somewhere Judge Easton was watching it all tighten like a vice he couldn't unscrew. But retaliation doesn't always come from the top. Sometimes it seeps in from below quiet hands, pushing stories into corners, sowing doubt, misplacing documents, questioning your tone in a meeting where no one raised their voice. And by the end of that week, Derek felt it settle in his bones like a chill that no jacket could shake. Late Friday evening, just past dusk, he found himself driving not home, but toward the old city records office, a squat gray building tucked behind the public library, forgotten by most, remembered by few. It was there that archived court recordings were kept untouched by politics, immune to edits. He parked under a flickering streetlight, stepped out into the crisp night, and took a slow breath before walking up the stone steps. Inside, the air was stale with dust and fluorescent lighting, and the only sound was the soft hum of an overhead fan rotating lazily above the main desk. The clerk behind the counter was a woman in her 60s, hair pulled back, tight eyes, sharp behind thick glasses, and a crossword puzzle spread before her like a battlefield of its own. She looked up as Derek approached her pen, pausing mid-square. "Evenin'," she said, voice dry. "You don't look like the usual Saturday historians." "I'm not," Derek replied. "I'm here for court audio. Easton Bench Sessions, 2014 to 2016. She blinked slowly, then turned in her seat. "That's a lot of listening. You got a court order?" "I've got a clearance," he said, handing over his ID. "Federal authority, full access." She glanced at the badge, then at him, and something in her expression softened, not out of familiarity but out of recognition. "You're the one in the paper," she said after a beat, "the one stirring all that dust." Derek didn't smile. It needed stirring. She nodded once, as if accepting that, then disappeared behind a row of cabinets. While he waited, he sat down on one of the hard plastic chairs along the far wall, his knees bent awkwardly, elbows resting on his thighs. The room smelled of paper and old air, and for a brief moment the silence settled like a blanket over his shoulders. He could feel the fatigue catching up days without sleep, nights filled with guarded phone calls and backup plans, and yet beneath it all, there was still that thread of clarity that kept pulling him forward. The clerk returned with a box of labeled tapes stacked neatly, each one marked with dates and docket numbers, the ink slightly faded. She slid them across the counter without another word. "Room's in the back. Speaker's old, but she still tells the truth." Derek carried the box to the listening station, a dim alcove with one stool, one speaker, and a single desk lamp that buzzed faintly as it warmed to life. He placed the first tape in the deck, pressed play, and leaned forward as the static gave way to a familiar voice, firm, clipped, authoritative. "And given the defendant's repeated interruptions, the court sees no choice but to assign the maximum fine permitted under statute." He closed his eyes and listened. Case after case, pattern after pattern. Defendants whose voices trembled as they tried to explain they'd misunderstood a date, or hadn't received the right form, or simply couldn't afford the $100 parking fee. Easton's responses were always the same, icy, dismissive, laced with a calm that sounded lawful but smelled like punishment. Derek took notes, time-stamped each clip, and felt his pulse tighten with every ruling that mirrored the last. One particular tape brought him still. A young black man, barely out of college, stood in front of Easton asking for a deferment to pay a court fee. His voice was soft, respectful, nearly apologetic. Easton responded not with understanding but with contempt. "Perhaps next time you'll consider the cost before making irresponsible choices." Derek leaned back slowly, hand still resting on the pause button. The young man's voice, he knew it. Not personally, but deeply. It was the sound of so many others who had stood before that bench and learned that respect alone would never be enough. The clock on the wall ticked past 10. Derek closed the file, rewound the tape, and packed everything back into the box. As he walked out of the room, he paused for a moment at the front desk. The clerk was gathering her things. She looked up, eyebrow raised. "You find what you needed?" Derek nodded. "I found what they hoped no one would listen to." She gave a low hum of approval, then pulled her sweater tight across her shoulders. "Some stories don't live on paper," she said. "They live in tone and silence. And who gets interrupted? He offered a quiet thank you, then stepped back into the night, the box pressed against his chest, the air colder now but cleaner somehow. The streetlight overhead flickered once more, but this time it stayed on. And under that thin cone of yellow light, Derek didn't feel hunted, have felt ready. By Monday morning, the storm Derek Langston had long anticipated had finally arrived, not with sirens or subpoenas, but in the form of a memo. It landed on his desk, just after 9, printed on clean white paper, and folded precisely once, as if the neatness could hide the intent inside. He recognized the sender before he even opened it. Office of Internal Affairs. Short. Unsigned. Summoning him for a clarification meeting regarding his recent conduct in the Easton inquiry. No accusations, not yet. But the subtext wasn't subtle. It was a warning wrapped in protocol. He read it twice, not because he needed to, but because the weight of it pressed against something deeper, something personal. He placed the memo down, sat back in his chair, and stared through the narrow slit of his window, where morning light spilled over the brick courtyard below like a soft accusation. The wheels were turning. The system had noticed, and the system did not appreciate being challenged. He could feel it in the atmosphere of the office, a tension that crackled just beneath the surface, like the pause before thunder. Conversations lowered as he passed. Smiles tightened. Doors once left open now closed with soft, deliberate clicks. He'd been here before, in different ways, under different names. And the pattern never changed. Expose enough truth and you become the problem instead of the solution. But he wasn't here to be liked. He was here to finish what he started. That afternoon he arrived at the meeting 5 minutes early, his shoes clicking against the hallway tile with quiet determination. The room was sterile and too bright, one of those spaces designed to unsettle more than welcome. A long table, 2 chairs, a recording device at the center. Across from him sat Special Counsel Reyes, a sharp-eyed woman with a folder thicker than the one he'd submitted to the Justice Department 3 weeks prior. She didn't rise when he entered. Just gestured toward the chair across from her. "Mr. Langston," she said, tone, formal voice even. "This is an informal review, but I must remind you this conversation is being recorded." Derek nodded, once removed his coat and took his seat. "Informal's doing a lot of heavy lifting," he said. Her lips curled, not quite a smile. "Let's begin." What followed was less a conversation than a performance, an hour of carefully phrased questions masked as curiosity. Reyes asked about his motives, his sources, the timing of his report. She questioned whether his findings had been peer-reviewed, whether he had given the judge a fair opportunity to respond, whether this pursuit of justice might in fact be personal. Derek kept his voice low and clear, choosing his words not just for truth, but for precision. "I reported data," he said. "The pattern wasn't ambiguous. The decisions weren't defensible. I did what was required of me." She leaned forward, fingertips pressed together. "And do you believe that you personally are the most objective party to carry this forward?" He didn't blink. "I believe I'm the only one who didn't look away." That landed like a stone dropped into still water, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Finally, Reyes closed her folder. "You're dismissed. For now." He stood, buttoned his coat slowly, then looked down at her one last time. "You should listen to those tapes," he said softly. "You'll hear what justice sounds like when it's used as a weapon." She didn't respond, and he didn't wait for one. Outside, the wind had picked up, scattering the last brittle leaves across the marble steps of the building. Derek paused on the sidewalk, letting the cold air slice across his skin, not flinching, not moving. Just breathing. The truth was out, and now they were trying to drag him into the mud, hoping he'd slip, hoping he'd stumble. But he wouldn't, because he knew something they didn't. He wasn't alone anymore. Word had begun to spread not just in newspapers but in whispered phone calls, in late-night emails from former colleagues, in text messages from clerks who had always suspected but never dared speak. The weight he once carried alone was now shared, even if just in fragments, and that he realized was enough to keep going. That evening he found himself back at the neighborhood church, where his father once volunteered, an old red-brick chapel on the corner of Tremont and Maple, where the pews creaked and the stained glass caught the sunset just right. He didn't go there for prayer, not exactly. He went for silence, for memory, for something solid when the ground everywhere else felt like shifting sand. The chapel was empty, save for the janitor sweeping in the back and a single votive candle flickering beneath the altar. Derek sat halfway down the aisle, hands folded in his lap, shoulders bent beneath the weight of the past few weeks. He looked up at the ceiling, high and wooden, and thought of all the voices that had filled this place across generations, hopeful, broken, defiant, tired. Footsteps approached behind him, light, deliberate. He turned and saw Mara Dixon entering quietly, her coat still dusted with wind, her face unreadable. "They're not backing down," she said. "No greeting, just truth." He nodded. "I know." She sat beside him, her presence grounding her silence, comforting in a way few things were. After a moment she said, "You scared them." "Good," he replied, voice rough. "You should be careful." "I am." And then softer, "But I'm not stopping." Mara looked over at him, her expression shifting from concern to quiet understanding. "I didn't think you would." They sat together in the stillness, the candle's flame dancing against the glass, casting long shadows across the floor. Outside, the wind rattled the windows gently like a question waiting to be answered. And inside, Derek closed his eyes, let the silence settle deep into his chest, and held on to one clear thought. They were coming for him, but they were late. Because he was already standing. The courtroom was unusually full that morning, not with defendants or lawyers waiting their turn, but with quiet spectators who had begun to sense that something was about to shift. The kind of crowd that doesn't need to be invited, just drawn by the smell of change. Sunlight filtered in through the tall windows in long slashes of gold, illuminating flecks of dust, as if even the air itself was waiting to witness what would unfold. Derek Langston stood at the edge of the aisle, hands clasped in front of him, breathing slow and deliberate, as if rehearsing stillness was the only way to keep the rising weight in his chest from spilling over. He had worn a plain navy suit that morning, not the sharpest one, not the newest, but the one his father had given him when he passed the bar, still lined with the blessing of someone who had survived worse. Around him the murmurs quieted, as the bailiff called the room to order, and all eyes turned to the high bench, where Judge Roy Easton was already seated, posture straight, expression unreadable. For a man accused of systematic abuse of power, he looked remarkably calm, perhaps too calm, as though convinced that tradition would protect him from truth. The prosecutor's table was empty. Derek didn't walk toward it. He walked straight to the lectern, a quiet ripple of whispers following his every step, and placed the sealed folder gently on its surface. Then he raised his head, locked eyes with Easton, and began. "Your Honor, before we proceed with today's docket, I respectfully submit a motion to introduce new evidence related to ongoing judicial misconduct." The room inhaled as one. Easton leaned forward slightly, folding his hands, lips pursed. "Mr. Langston, this is highly irregular. The court is not your forum for theatrics." "No, sir," Derek replied evenly. "It's a forum for justice. And justice can't begin until corruption is named." Gasps rose from the benches. Easton's face hardened, but his voice remained controlled. "Unless you have explicit authorization from the Office of the Inspector General, this court will not—" "I do," Derek interrupted, holding up a stamped letter bearing the federal seal. "And they are watching Judge. Right now. In real time." There was a pause. A long one. Then Easton gestured sharply toward the bailiff. "Take that document into chambers for verification." The bailiff moved, but slowly, as if aware the room had shifted its center of gravity. Derek stepped back, folded his arms, and let the silence sit. Around him, the spectators leaned forward, drawn into the pressure, watching not just for what would be said, but for who would crack first. 10 minutes later, the bailiff returned with a subtle nod toward the bench. Easton's jaw clenched. "Proceed," he muttered. Derek opened the folder. Inside were audio transcripts, case records, and annotated rulings dating back over 10 years, an unbroken line of patterns that revealed racial bias so consistent it could no longer be excused as coincidence. He began reading, not loudly, not theatrically, but clearly, his voice the only sound in a courtroom that now held its breath. Case by case, sentence by sentence, names, dates, fines. Disparities so wide they could no longer be ignored. And then came the tapes. The court technician played them through the overhead system, voices echoing across the chamber. In one, Easton cut off a young black defendant mid-sentence, fining him without explanation. In another, he laughed quietly as a Latina mother tried to explain why she'd missed her hearing due to childcare. The murmurs returned, this time darker, sharper, people turning toward one another with furrowed brows and tight jaws, realizing this wasn't about a few bad decisions. This was a pattern. This was abuse. When the last tape ended, Derek stepped back to the lectern. "These are not isolated incidents," he said quietly. These are choices repeated, uncorrected, and inflicted on vulnerable people over and over again. Easton shifted in his chair for the first time, no longer composed. "You're out of line, counselor." "No, Derek," replied his voice, firm but never raised. "I'm right where I need to be." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of reckoning of the weight of years, finally spoken aloud in a room that had so often swallowed the pain of others without flinching. From the bench, Easton's eyes darted toward the rear of the courtroom, where a tall, suited man had just entered and taken a seat near the back. DOJ. No badge, no announcement. But everyone knew. The judge looked back at Derek, his voice quieter now. "Is this about revenge?" "It's about accountability," Derek said. "Something this court has demanded from others, but has long refused to accept for itself." And with that he closed the folder, stepped away, and returned to his seat. The judge said nothing. The docket was abandoned. The hearing was recessed. And as people began to file out, some in awe, some in fury, some in silent shaking gratitude, Derek remained seated alone, hands folded once more. The sun had shifted by then, casting a deeper gold across the marble floors, and the air no longer felt like a room held hostage by power. It felt for the first time like justice had stepped through the door. And it had a voice. The press conference wasn't held in a grand hall or behind a podium flanked by flags. It was on the courthouse steps right beneath the tarnished brass plaque that read "Justice Through Law," the irony of which was not lost on anyone that morning. Derek Langston stood behind a makeshift podium, flanked by two local civil rights attorneys, both of whom had stayed late the night before helping him prepare. A gentle wind rustled through the trees overhead, and the faint hum of traffic filled the silence that fell over the small crowd gathered in front of him. Journalists, activists, courthouse employees on break, and ordinary citizens who had heard whispers of what was coming. His hands were steady, but his jaw tightened just slightly before he spoke. "Good morning. My name is Derek Langston, and I stand here today not as an accuser but as a witness to a pattern so persistent, so quietly corrosive, it demanded more than silence." The microphones crackled as he spoke, and the cameras clicked rapidly like a swarm of locusts, hungry for something real. Behind his calm tone was a week of sleepless nights of second-guessing of the voices of mentors, both living and gone, telling him this day would come, and it would cost him. "Still," he continued, "over the last year I have compiled documentation recordings and sworn statements detailing acts of judicial bias under Judge Roy Easton's tenure. These are not opinions. These are facts. These are voices the court dismissed, ignored, and in some cases punished for speaking." A low murmur swept through the crowd as he unfolded a copy of a redacted court transcript, one of dozens where black and brown defendants received steeper fines, less time to speak, and harsher outcomes for the same offenses as their white counterparts. He read excerpts aloud. The words in their rawness needed no embellishment. They rang sharp in the open air, their weight cutting through the chatter like cold glass. The questions began quickly after that. A young reporter in a gray windbreaker stepped forward, his notepad shaking slightly in the wind. "Mr. Langston, why come forward now? What changed?" Derek's eyes met his without flinching. "Nothing changed. That's the point. Nothing changed for years. And I realized waiting for a better time meant more people getting hurt." Another voice rose, this one deeper, more skeptical. "Aren't you concerned about the optics, about turning this into a media circus?" "I'm not interested in optics," he said. "I'm interested in integrity. The truth should never need a stage to matter." As the cameras kept flashing and the murmurs swelled, he felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Not applause, not yet support, but attention. Real attention. And with it came responsibility. After the statement, Derek stepped away from the podium and stood beside the civil rights team, who quickly fielded additional questions. He didn't need to speak further. His role was clear. He had ignited the match. Now the light had to spread. He moved through the crowd, slowly shaking a few hands, nodding at familiar faces. An older black woman in a long wool coat pressed her fingers gently to his wrist as he passed. Her voice trembled barely more than a whisper. "My son. He went before that judge. He never stood a chance." Derek placed his other hand over hers and simply said, "I know." He didn't offer promises. He offered presence. By mid-afternoon, the story had already gone national. Cable news headlines rolled across television screens with urgency. "Federal prosecutor exposes racial bias in courtroom." Social media erupted in threads, photos of Derek at the podium flooding timelines with hashtags that hadn't existed that morning. And while some questioned his motives, others dug into Easton's history, uncovering more than even Derek had dared to hope. Inside the courthouse, silence took on a different quality. Offices grew quieter. Conversations stopped when he walked by, not out of avoidance anymore, but because people were watching to see what would happen next. And some, for the first time, wondering what role they had played in letting things slide for so long. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned amber over the city skyline, Derek sat alone in his apartment, the noise of the day finally at bay. He poured a glass of water, not wine. His mind needed clarity now, more than comfort, and stood at the window overlooking the quiet street below. The city had changed that day, if only slightly, if only briefly. His phone buzzed on the counter. A message from his younger sister popped up. "I'm proud of you, but be careful. They won't take this lying down." He stared at the words for a moment, then replied, "I know, but I'm not afraid." He wasn't lying. He wasn't fearless either. He was something quieter, something steadier, resolved. Because now the truth wasn't just his burden. It was out there, living in sound bites and newsprint, living in courtroom whispers and family dinner conversations. And that made it harder to bury. Outside, the first few stars had begun to appear faint but steady above the city's glow. And as Derek leaned against the cool glass eyes, steady, heart-heavy but unshaken, he felt something new take root beneath his fatigue. Not hope exactly, but momentum. And momentum, once it begins, is hard to stop. The days after the press conference unfolded like a wave that never stopped swelling, cresting not with celebration but with consequence. Derek Langston returned to the federal building early each morning, walking through its polished halls beneath flickering fluorescent lights, nodding to faces he no longer trusted to smile back. The silence around him had taken on a sharper shape, not the silence of people unsure, but the silence of people deciding which side of history they were willing to be seen on. In the break room, conversations paused as he entered, coffee mugs frozen mid-air, eye contact suddenly evasive. On the elevator, his greetings were returned with polite nods and tight-lipped expressions, as though proximity to him now meant risk. He understood it. He didn't resent it. Fear makes cowards of some and quiet heroes of others, and you don't know which is which until the moment arrives. But the phones rang more often now, not from inside the building but from outside it. Past clients, attorneys, public defenders, and judges from neighboring districts began to reach out, first in hushed tones, then in braver voices. One young defense attorney left a voicemail Derek would never delete. "I've worked 6 years under Easton's courtroom. I thought it was just me. Turns out I wasn't paranoid. Thank you." The community, though, was split. As the story spread, it polarized in real time. Local radio stations debated it openly. Conservative hosts questioned Derek's motives, painting him as disgruntled or politically ambitious, while community leaders, especially in Black and Latino neighborhoods, gathered in church halls and union basements to share stories most never officially documented, many still raw with quiet rage. A retired pastor approached Derek after a community town hall, voice, low face drawn. "You said what we've all been whispering for 30 years, he said. "But saying it out loud, that takes more than courage. It takes knowing you'll lose something." And Derek had begun to lose. Not in dramatic ways, not yet. But in small cuts that bled slow. 2 speaking engagements were canceled without explanation. An invitation to an interagency conference mysteriously disappeared. An old colleague who once called him brother now refused to make eye contact in meetings. His email requests took longer to get answered. Internal memos began to exclude his department without direct notification. Worse still, he received a hand-delivered envelope without a return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a printed message, "Sleep with one eye open. Whistleblowers bleed first." He read it once, folded it, and slid it into his bottom drawer. He didn't tell anyone. Not yet. Instead, he doubled down. He met with advocacy groups. He opened his schedule to student law associations. He agreed to participate in a local forum moderated by a retired appellate judge who once clerked under Thurgood Marshall. The event was tense, charged, uncomfortable, exactly as it should have been. And yet by the end, when the moderator looked him squarely in the eye and said, "What you did reminded this city what integrity looks like," he felt the first exhale he'd had in days. But not everyone wanted integrity. Some wanted quiet, others wanted control, and a few wanted revenge. One Thursday morning, a formal complaint was filed against Derek with the Office of Professional Responsibility. It alleged improper conduct, abuse of position, and violation of prosecutorial neutrality. The language was slippery, designed not to convict but to stain. Its timing wasn't coincidental, its source was anonymous. But Derek recognized the tactic immediately. The goal wasn't to win, it was to wear him down. Still, he didn't flinch. He submitted his official response by noon the next day, 3 pages long, not defensive, but definitive. He cited protocol, precedent, and ethics law, then signed his name in ink that didn't shake. That night he sat on the front porch of his sister's home just outside the city, sipping sweet tea under the soft amber of porch lights while her kids played on the lawn. She watched him for a long moment before finally speaking. "You look tired, Dee." "I am," he admitted, watching the kids dart through the grass, carefree and untouched by politics or power. "Does it ever stop?" she asked. "The pressure," he said. "Number. But you get stronger under it." She gave him a long, slow look, then reached over and squeezed his hand. "You're not alone in this, even if it feels like it." And for the first time in weeks, he let that truth sink in, not just intellectually, but physically. It softened something inside him that had been clenched too long. Later that weekend, he returned to the neighborhood barbershop where his father used to take him as a child. It smelled like talcum powder and clippers, and the same old Motown songs played low in the background. The moment he walked in, the owner paused mid-conversation and nodded. "There he is," he said, voice proud but gentle. The man shaking pillars. Derek laughed, but quietly, as he took a seat near the back. The shop was full of conversation, some about football, some about housing prices, and yes, some about the courthouse. A younger man, no older than 25, leaned across his chair and asked, "So what happens next, Mr. Langston? You think they're going to take Easton down?" Derek didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked around the room at the elders, at the barbers, at the kids, getting their edges shaped sharp, at the men, waiting their turn in patience and familiarity. Then he said, "I think justice has already begun. You don't bring it down all at once. You wear it out, brick by brick, with truth." And the room for a brief moment was quiet, not out of doubt, but respect. Outside, the sky turned a soft lavender and the scent of rain drifted in on a spring breeze. And Derek Langston, sitting in the back of a place that remembered who he was before the world did, knew he had not been broken, only tested, and still standing. It started quietly, too quietly in fact, for Derek Langston to believe it was over. A few days had passed since the formal complaint against him had been dismissed, the Office of Professional Responsibility, citing insufficient grounds and lack of evidence. But anyone who had worked inside the system long enough knew that when power feels cornered, it doesn't retreat, it recalibrates. And Judge Roy Easton had been uncharacteristically silent. No statements to the press, no legal countersuits, no public remarks, not even his usual comments slipped through court reporters or hallway whispers. It was the kind of stillness that warned of a coming storm. Derek felt it first in his case assignments. They began to shift subtly. Cases he'd previously handled, ones that required experience and nuance, were being reassigned without notice, passed on to junior staff with no clear explanation. At first, he chalked it up to restructuring. But when 3 in a row were transferred, and his calendar suddenly appeared half empty, the pattern could no longer be ignored. He brought it up with his direct superior in a closed-door meeting. "Just streamlining operations," the supervisor said without meeting his eyes. "Nothing personal, Derek, it's just better optics for now." Derek leaned back in the chair, folding his hands calmly but tightly. Better optics for who, he asked. There was no answer. Later that week, an internal memo circulated from the judge's chambers, a review of prosecutorial conduct, targeting no one by name, but aimed squarely in Derek's direction. Its language was clinical, its tone detached, but the message was clear: step out of line again, and we'll come for your badge, not just your name. He read the memo twice, then folded it neatly and slid it into his case file. He wouldn't respond, not yet. Responding would make it real. Right now, he needed time to think, to see how far Easton was willing to go. But Easton didn't wait. On Monday morning, Derek arrived at court for a scheduled pre-trial motion. He was early as usual, dressed in a navy suit, clean-shaven briefcase in hand. The hallway outside courtroom 3B was filled with the usual shuffle of lawyers, defendants, and officers going through the morning routine. Nothing felt unusual until he stepped inside. Judge Easton was already on the bench, lips pressed into a thin line, eyes colder than the marble walls surrounding them. Derek's client, a young man named Elijah Green, was seated at the defense table, eyes darting nervously as he whispered something to his public defender. As Derek took his place at the prosecution table, Easton's voice rang out sharper than necessary. "Mr. Langston, we weren't expecting you on this case. I thought it had been reassigned." Derek raised his chin just slightly. "I was reconfirmed by Deputy Chief Monroe late last night. The file should be in chambers." Easton's nostrils flared a subtle, involuntary reaction, but he said nothing more. Instead, he shifted papers, cleared his throat, and continued the session with an icy professionalism that felt like a blade pressed beneath the surface. But the real blow didn't come until later that day. While Derek was out for lunch 15 minutes just around the corner, someone entered his office. Nothing was stolen, nothing obvious displaced, but he noticed immediately that the photo of his daughter, usually tilted slightly left on his desk, now faced perfectly forward. He checked the drawers. His flash drive was missing. The backup drive was still there, but he could feel the air in the room had changed. Like someone had exhaled secrets they weren't supposed to know. He filed an internal report quietly without alarm, and changed every password before the sun set. That evening his phone rang as he stepped through his apartment door. It was an unfamiliar number, but local. He answered. A voicemail. "Calm, too calm," said only. "You've made your point, Langston. Now sit down, or we'll make sure the next leak isn't about your cases, it's about your personal life." Then the line went dead. He didn't sleep that night. Not out of fear, but vigilance. He knew where this was going. It wasn't about discrediting the evidence anymore. It was about discrediting him, his integrity, his discipline, his family, and if they couldn't find something real, they'd fabricate it. So the next morning, he beat the sun to the office. He typed out a sworn affidavit detailing every event, reassignments, the break-in, the phone call, and filed it under sealed record with the DOJ Internal Affairs Division. He made 3 hard copies and 1 encrypted digital backup, storing each in separate locations. He spoke to no one about it. Not yet. Let them think he was unaware. Let them think he was breaking. But inside, he had never been more clear. He walked into the courtroom that day, not with anger, but with something harder to shatter: resolve. He met Judge Easton's glare with an expression so still, so unreadable, it left the courtroom air brittle. He said nothing extra. He made no gestures. But his presence alone was a declaration: "I see you, and I'm not leaving." And as the gavel came down at the end of the session, echoing across the emptying chamber, Derek Langston stood tall, gathered his files, and exited the courtroom slowly, head high, spine straight. Outside, the spring air was brisk and clean, and for the first time in weeks, as he walked past the courthouse steps, he smiled, not because the battle was over, but because they had shown their hand. And that meant he was closer to the truth than they were ready for. The courtroom that morning carried a different kind of tension, not the usual undercurrent of bureaucracy and backlogged justice, but something sharper, closer to electricity. Derek Langston stood just inside the double oak doors of courtroom 7C, the familiar scent of old paper and lemon floor wax rising to meet him. The gallery was unusually full for a midweek hearing, with journalists, community leaders, and legal aides packed into the benches, their eyes scanning the room with quiet expectancy. Cameras weren't allowed, but the presence of truth was, and Derek felt its weight pressing against the fabric of his tailored gray suit. He moved forward with slow, steady steps, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor with each movement that seemed heavier than the last. In his left hand, he carried a single manila folder, nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just the facts. But inside that folder was a bomb that didn't need an explosion. It only needed to be read aloud. At the front of the room, seated behind the tall bench with its brass nameplate and towering authority, was Judge Roy Easton, still cloaked in black, still wearing that same stone expression that had ruled this courtroom for nearly 2 decades. His hands were folded neatly, his fingers laced together in calculated calm. But Derek noticed the small twitch in his right thumb, the subtle shift of his jaw. The man was uneasy, even if his posture refused to show it. "Mr. Langston," the judge began, his voice echoing with forced decorum, "I understand you've requested to make a statement before today's docket begins." Derek nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor. With the court's permission, I'd like to address the room on matters of public concern." Easton paused, then motioned with a slight wave of his hand. "Proceed." The room fell so silent that even the creak of someone shifting on the wooden bench seemed amplified. Derek stepped forward, unfolded the manila folder, and took a breath that reached all the way to his ribs. For the record, he began, voice steady but not loud. My name is Derek Isaiah Langston, Assistant United States Prosecutor for the Southern District. Today I am speaking not on behalf of my office, but as a private citizen under the protection of the First Amendment and compelled by a moral obligation to truth. He didn't look down at the page yet. He looked up at the people. At the beginning of this year, he continued, I was assigned to several cases that brought me repeatedly into Judge Easton's courtroom. What I observed during those proceedings was not merely legal inconsistency or human error. What I witnessed, what others have endured silently for years, was a pattern of racial bias, procedural misconduct, and the selective silencing of marginalized voices. A murmur rippled through the gallery, low and quick like wind brushing through tall grass. Derek remained still. I documented the judge's decisions, how often he interrupted attorneys of color, how frequently he overruled objections that would have been sustained elsewhere, how his sentencing tilted consistently toward the harshest extremes when the defendant was black or Hispanic. I gathered transcripts. I interviewed former clerks, legal aides, and public defenders who'd worked under him. Now he looked down, opened the folder, and raised a document. This, he said, holding it aloft, is a signed affidavit from one of Judge Easton's former clerks who resigned in 2021 after witnessing the deliberate manipulation of jury instructions in 3 separate trials. He lowered the page, placed it gently on the podium, and raised another. This is a comparative analysis of 200 sentencing decisions made over the last 5 years, showing a statistically significant disparity based on race, more than double the punitive measures against black men compared to white defendants with comparable charges and histories. Gasps, this time audible and unrestrained. Easton shifted, his face still set like granite, but a flicker of pink now rising at the edges of his ears. Derek continued, not as an orator but as a man unloading a burden too long carried. This is not vengeance, he said quietly. This is not personal. This is the pursuit of something older and deeper than any of us in this room. Justice unclouded by ego, law unbent by prejudice, and systems accountable not only in principle but in practice. He paused, then looked directly at Easton. Your Honor, I present these findings not to shame you in front of your peers, but to remind the system that no one is beyond review, not even the bench. Easton's lips parted slightly. For a moment it seemed he might speak, but no words came. Only the dry movement of breath and pride struggling to stay afloat. Derek turned back to the gallery. I will be submitting this documentation to the State Judicial Commission, to the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, and to the relevant oversight committees within the federal system. Today marks not a conclusion but a beginning. Of truth. Of correction. Of necessary consequence. Then he stepped back, folded the folder shut, and let the silence fill the room like water flooding through a broken dam. After several seconds, Judge Easton cleared his throat. Thank you, Mr. Langston. The court will take today's matters under advisement. But even he knew the courtroom wasn't his anymore. Outside, when Derek stepped into the midday sun, the warmth felt different. Not the heat of pressure, but the burn of light. Reporters swarmed toward the stairs, questions flying, cameras blinking. But he raised one hand not to dismiss, but to steady the chaos. No comments, he said gently, the evidence speaks loud enough. He walked past them without hurry, down the steps, through the crowd, into the street. And as the courthouse doors closed behind him, the city didn't erupt, but it shifted. Something cracked. Something gave way, and somewhere deep inside the stone pillars of power, the echo of that moment would live longer than any sentence ever passed. Derek Langston didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply kept walking, and the truth walked with him. In life, there are moments when standing up for what's right feels like standing alone, but stories like Derek Langston's remind us that integrity is never wasted. No matter your age, your voice carries weight when it speaks the truth. Derek didn't seek revenge. He sought accountability, not just for himself, but for all the people silenced by injustice. And he did it calmly, clearly, and with undeniable proof. That's the lesson we can take with us. Courage isn't always loud. It's often quiet, deliberate, and unwavering. Whether you're in a courtroom or at your own kitchen table, you have the power to hold others accountable with truth and grace. As we grow older, we realize that legacy isn't about titles or trophies. It's about the strength to do what's right when it's hardest. So speak up when it matters. Stand firm even when you're pressured to back down. Because sometimes one calm voice backed by truth and character can shift the weight of an entire system. and that, my friend, is a power no one can take from you. If this story moved you or reminded you of the quiet strength we all carry within us, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We share powerful stories that speak to justice, dignity, and truth, especially for those who've seen enough of life to know what really matters. And if you believe more people need to hear voices like Derek share this with someone who needs a little reminder, it's never too late to stand tall.